It was to be an uneventful layover. Emma was a freelance photographer with an avid penchant for traveling. She had just completed an assignment in Tokyo. She had 3 hours for a connecting flight from there to Denver, in which she could grab coffee, respond to emails, and scroll through the numerous pictures in her camera. The terminal hummed with its usual vitality. Families reunited, couples snatching kisses, and tired travelers lugging suitcases from one gate to another. Emma had discovered an oasis in the small coffee shop tucked near Gate 17. She nursed her latte, letting herself get lost in editing her recent work. Hours passed until an announcement jarred her out of her reverie. Attention all passengers. Due to unforeseen circumstances, all flights are grounded until further notice. Please remain in the terminal and await further instructions. Her stomach tightened. Unforeseen circumstances. The words hung heavy in the air, seeding unease among the travelers. Emma glanced around. The previously bustling terminal had fallen eerily silent. Murmurs of confusion spread, and the once vibrant energy shifted to a palpable tension. The announcement repeated, and then the heavy metallic shutters slamming down over the terminal's exits. Her heart racing, Emma realized she and everyone else was being locked in. Travelers rushed to their phones only to be met with the murmur of dismay. No signal. Even airport Wi-Fi was out. A security officer stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Stay calm, please. We are investigating a situation. Stay where you are for your safety." Emma couldn't get the strange wording out of her head. A situation. Was it a threat? A technical malfunction? Her brain ran through possibilities. She merged with a group of passengers near Gate 20, where a family of 4, a businessman, and an older woman clutching a small dog exchanged nervous glances. "Does anyone know what's going on?" asked the businessman, his voice strained. The father of the family shook his head. "No idea, but this doesn't feel right." Emma tried to listen to what the father said, but her eyes strayed away. Across the terminal, near the baggage claim, she saw a figure standing there. He was standing still, too still. His face was hidden by shadows, but Emma had this sense of unease, a nagging feeling that he watched her. Hours ticked by. The usual buzz of the terminal was replaced with an oppressive silence, broken only by whispers and the occasional clatter of a suitcase being dragged. Emma grew increasingly uneasy with each passing minute. Something was off. She decided to go exploring, hoping to get some information. Walking down towards the baggage claim, she was passing rows of abandoned kiosks and empty gates. Then she saw it, a torn open suitcase, its contents scattered all over the floor. Not far from the suitcase was a child's stuffed bear lying face down, its one button eye missing. The air was heavier there, as if the walls were closing in. Emma picked up the bear, a chill running down her spine. As she turned to leave, she saw the figure again. This time, they were closer. The shadow cast by their presence seemed unnatural, stretching and bending in ways that defied the terminal's fluorescent lights. Emma's breath hitched as the figure tilted its head, acknowledging her. She bolted. Back near Gate 20, Emma found the group she had spoken to earlier, or what was left of them. The businessman and the older woman were gone. Only the family remained, but their faces were pale, their expressions haunted. "Where is everybody?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The mother shook her head, clutching her children tightly. They just disappeared. One moment they were here, and then her voice cracked. And then they weren't. She felt the words against her, but she could not shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She turned to see the figure again, this time at the edge of the gate's seating area. The form was clearer, but the face was still void, a swirling darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of her mind. Determined to find answers, Emma ventured deeper into the terminal. She avoided the figure, whose presence seemed to grow stronger the closer she got to the shuttered exits. Near a maintenance corridor, she found a security badge on the floor, smeared with something dark and sticky. Her stomach turned as she realized it was blood. She pushed open a door closer to her and stepped into the staff room. The light flickered. It all seemed to flicker a strobe on this unquiet space. Desks were overturned. Monitors crackled with static. What looked like blood, it was scrawled, "They're already inside." The message shot a chill of fear through Emma. She backed out of the room, every instinct screaming to run. But when she turned, she froze. The figure stood in the doorway, its shadow stretching toward her like grasping hands. Emma ran down the corridor, her breathing ragged. She didn't know where she was heading, only that she needed to get away. Terminal, once a maze of familiar shops and gates, now felt like an endless labyrinth. She entered a large atrium in which the main security checkpoint rose like a wall. Suitcases were strewn all over the floor, and their owners were nowhere to be seen. Then she saw them, silhouettes moving in the distance, jerky and unnatural. They weren't passengers or staff. They were something else. She could have sworn that one of them shifted towards her. Emma felt the blood drain from her veins. The face on the thing was a mocking mockery of human features, hollow eyes, and its mouth was an impossible size, stretching far too wide. It growled with a scream and a sound and began moving toward her. Emma's survival instincts kicked in. She ducked behind a row of metal detectors, using the equipment as a barrier. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Were these creatures responsible for the lockdown? And what had happened to the missing people? As the creature closed in, Emma saw an emergency exit sign glowing faintly in the distance. Summoning every ounce of courage, she made a break for it. The creature gave chase, its inhuman screeches echoing through the terminal. Emma hit the door with her entire weight. It did not give. Panicked, she felt for the security badge she had discovered earlier and swiped it against the reader. The lock clicked open, and she flung herself outside. The cold night air hit her like a wave, and for the briefest of moments, she felt safe. Turning to look back at the terminal, her heart sank. The windows were dark, but she could see the shadows of countless figures moving inside, their glowing eyes fixed on her. She did not stop running until she got to the perimeter road at the airport. She hopped in a passing car, begging for help. The man, middle-aged with a kind face, hesitated but let her in anyway. As they sped away, Emma glanced back one last time. The terminal loomed in the distance, its once familiar silhouette now a menacing shadow against the night sky. She knew she'd never set foot in an airport again. Days passed, and Emma searched through the news for anything related to the closure of the airport. Nothing appeared. No reports, no eyewitness accounts, nor a single report of delayed flights. It was like it never happened. But Emma knew the truth. She had survived something incomprehensible, something which was haunting her every moment that she closed her eyes over. And though she was free, she was sure that the shadows had watched her, waiting for their chance to come again and return. Before moving on to the next story, if this is your first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for the next stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. It was getting close to midnight when Emily entered the terminal of Gate 47. Scanning the other passengers for a glimpse of tiredness in their faces, there was something about this flight that she could not grasp as she looked around. Either it was that her layover had taken longer than expected, or perhaps an unexplainable feeling hovering above the airport that did not let her settle down easily. She looked at the clock again, 11:58 p.m., and then down at her ticket. Flight 472, New York to Chicago, non-stop. Her phone buzzed in her hand and she sighed, taking a moment to look at the text. "I hope you're okay. Don't stay up too late. Call me when you land. Love, Mom." She smiled. Emily was always a little bad at keeping in touch, usually when traveling for work, but tonight something was a little different. She can feel the weight of all that darkness pressing on her side, not even a sense of it weighing on that carry-on. It had been a tough few months. She had lost her father suddenly, and her work had been demanding. The stress, the exhaustion, everything was beginning to take its toll. A late-night flight seemed like a good way to escape for a while. But as she boarded the plane and found her seat, something inside her whispered that she should have waited for the morning flight instead. The cabin was nearly empty, with only a few scattered passengers aboard, none of whom seemed to be in particularly high spirits. Emily slid into her window seat, looking out at the runway, the lights glinting off the dark pavement below. She buckled her seatbelt, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the restlessness that had taken root in her chest. The overhead lights flickered as the door closed and the hum of the engines began to fill the cabin. The air felt cold, almost sterile, and a shiver ran down her spine. Then, the flight attendants performed their final checks and the pilot came over the intercom, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Brooks. We are cleared for takeoff and will be cruising at 35,000 feet in no time. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Emily closed her eyes again, letting the familiar cadence of the plane as it climbed up lull her into a light sleep. The tension in her shoulders started to ease as well, and for an instant she felt safe. By the time Emily woke, the cabin was dim, illuminated only by the aisle lights. Most of the other passengers had fallen asleep. The steady hum of the plane was interrupted only by an occasional cough or rustle of a blanket. Then she saw him. The man was sitting across the aisle, 2 rows ahead, his face half hidden by the dark shadows cast by the overhead lights. His features were sharp but pale, almost ghostly in appearance. His eyes were wide and staring, but they weren't fixed on anything in particular. They looked. Emily felt a shiver run automatically down her spine as eyes met. There was an unsettling quality to the fact that he was staring in such a way that his gaze seemed to be getting right through her. His outfit was basic. An older jacket, jeans, scuffed boots, but of course it was about the eyes. His pupils were enlarged, giving a hollow, otherworldly look. It was odd because, when she boarded, she hadn't seen him. The aisle had been almost empty, with only a few scattered passengers. But now, there he was, seated as if he'd been there the whole time. She felt a cold sweat begin to bead on her forehead, and she looked away quickly, telling herself she was just overtired. But when she looked back a minute later, he hadn't budged an inch. His eyes were still on her. Something in the way he sat still, almost unnaturally so, made her shiver. She turned her head to the flight attendant, a young woman with a kind smile as she passed by. "Excuse me," Emily whispered to the attendant. "Who's sitting in that seat?" The flight attendant turned to follow the direction of her gaze, but when she espied the man, then her face changed, if only for a second. And then she turned toward Emily, a courteous smile still pasted on her mug. "I don't think you're making sense," she whispered. "That seat's empty." Her heart began to race. "No, I seen him. He's there." The flight attendant glanced at the man again, then shrugged. "Perhaps you're seeing things. This is a late flight, after all. I'll check in with you in a few moments, ma'am." And then, without explanation, she backed down the aisle and was gone. Emily stared at the empty seat in front of her. Had she dreamed up the man? She wasn't certain, but the sense of discomfort seemed to dig deeper into her stomach. The man's eyes were seared into her, even though he was no longer in the room. A weird feeling washed over her. Something was wrong beyond her understanding. As the hours went by, Emily tried to put the incident out of her head. The plane kept going on its steady course through the night sky, with the only sound being the soft hum of the engines and the quiet murmur of the other passengers. Yet, she couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. Around 2 a.m., she started noticing some strange things. The flight attendants, who had been so attentive at the start of the flight, now seemed curiously out of it. They stopped doing their usual rounds, and one of them was missing altogether. She saw several passengers whispering to one another in hushed tones, their eyes flicking nervously forward toward the front of the cabin. That's when she saw him again, a 2 row of space ahead him. He again sat, and his pale white face went hidden behind that darkness, but his big eyes seemed to be quite open, though now the features of that face were unlike himself, twisted, almost hurting, and his mouth just half opened seemed to prepare for speaking. Nothing more came out than a hollowness from between his lips. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her instinct screamed at her to get up, move, get out of that seat, but her body was frozen in place. Just then, the lights flickered again in the cabin with a low, almost imperceptible hum in the air, followed by a slight shudder which ran through the plane. The man rose. Emily's heart began to pound as she watched him move down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. His steps were slow, deliberate, but somehow smooth, almost too smooth, as if his feet weren't even touching the floor. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she followed every movement of his. Her hands were trembling, and her heart pounded in her chest. When he got to the back of the plane, he disappeared into the shadows. Moments later, Emily stood and walked to the back, her legs heavy as if she were wading through thick water. She passed the same flight attendants who now seemed oddly out of sync with their duties. One was sitting in the galley, her eyes vacant, staring at the wall. The other was standing by the emergency exit, unmoving, as if frozen in place. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice rising in panic. There's someone who..." But before she could finish, the cabin lights flickered again, and she froze in place. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. And then, in an instant, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no footprints, no sign of his going, no lingering scent or echo of his presence. He was gone, totally. The rest of the flight was a blur. When Emily returned to her seat, she tried to calm her racing mind. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of disbelief and fear, and she felt like she was losing touch with reality. She quickly gathered her belongings and left the plane as soon as it landed in Chicago, trying to shake off the feeling that something had followed her out of the plane. There were several crowds in the terminal, and it was busting. But the sense of restlessness lingered. She tried to reason that she had been experiencing this for too many nights running around due to late nightnesses. Deep within her, though, she knew something darker had been brewing. Weeks later, Emily discovered several other passengers had experienced a similar phenomenon during that particular flight. Odd sensations, unexplained occurrences, and fleeting glimpses of a figure no one could describe. It became clear that that flight carried with it something more than just people on board. It carried with it a mystery that could never be solved. Had it been a ghost, or something darker hiding in the shadows of night? Emily never shook off the feeling that something was waiting for her that night, and that it had watched her all along. The weeks that followed Emily's flight passed in a blur of unease. She tried to return to her daily life in Chicago, but there was something inside her that refused to let go of the memory. Every night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the images of the man's hollow eyes, his unnatural stillness, and the strange disappearance that defied all logic. She tried to brush it off as exhaustion, merely another symptom of all the stress from her dad's death, her loaded work schedule, and her long, uncomfortable hours in travel. But something inside, something she couldn't really identify, was eating away at her. At first, Emily thought it just might be a case of misremembering details, a trick of the mind. But then, she saw it something that just couldn't be explained away. It was just one of those typical Wednesday afternoons, and she was sitting at her table in the kitchen, trying to focus on the report from work. Her laptop had been open all this time while her mind continued to flash back to that night, specifically to the flight that has changed everything in her. Suddenly, there was that pop-up email on the screen with a subject like this: Flight 472 Incident Report. Curious and troubled, she opened it. The name did not display, but the message on the email spoke for itself. Dear Emily, if you're reading this, you're one of the few who encountered him on Flight 472. You're not alone. I've been investigating this for weeks now. Something dark happened on that plane, something no one is willing to admit. I need to meet you. T.D. West, Wes. Emily's heart was racing as she read and reread the email. The name D. West rang a bell. She remembered hearing that name whispered among the crew during her flight, though she hadn't paid attention at the time. A sense of dread crawled up her spine. Whoever this person was, they seemed to know something she didn't. She couldn't ignore it. Emily quickly responded, asking for a meeting, and soon arrangements were made. D. West would meet her the following evening at a small coffee shop near her apartment. That next evening, Emily arrived at the coffee shop early, with her fingers shaking as she wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Every few seconds, she cast an eye towards the door. Nobody had entered yet, though. The shop was quiet, save for a low hum of background music and the occasional clinking of cups. Then, at 7:15 p.m., the door opened, and a man entered, tall, gaunt, with a pale complexion. His face was shadowed by a hooded jacket, but Emily recognized the name on his badge. D. West, Air Traffic Controller. He sat across from her without a word, his piercing blue eyes never leaving hers. I knew you'd be the one to respond, he said softly, his voice low and steady. You were there on that flight. You saw him, didn't you? Emily nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The memory of the man's stare, his eyes so empty and yet so filled with something other, flooded back in vivid clarity. She felt herself trembling. Yes, she whispered, I saw him. But I don't understand. Who was he? Where did he go? D. West leaned in, his eyes narrowing as though weighing whether to trust her. I've been part of a team that monitors all commercial flights, including the weird ones. Flight 472 was one of those. It's difficult to explain. Emily's pulse quickened. What do you mean, difficult to explain? West's features turned grave. My line of work. I've seen a lot of things people won't discuss. But this is something other, something unnatural. He halted, trying to collect himself. There's a black site that we send flight anomalies. It's just out of sight from people. I've been searching Flight 472 because it experienced some sort of thing on that night. Something that can't be explained. I'm sure you've heard of the ghost flights. The ones that make their way into the news every once in a while. They're the ones that disappear for a few minutes, only to return without explanation. Well, Flight 472 wasn't like that. It was more like something had boarded that plane, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Emily's blood ran cold as she listened. I have spoken to other passengers on that flight, and they remember things that do not make sense. Flight attendants, crew members, they all swear they didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But those of us who were on the flight, those who felt it, we know something was wrong. That man you saw, he's the one who caused it. And the fact that he vanished, That's the key. Who was he? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. West leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as if trying to gather the courage to reveal what he knew. That man was no ordinary passenger, he said slowly. He was part of a much larger pattern of disappearances. Some people call them the lost ones. They show up on certain flights, certain routes, under very specific circumstances, these flights. They've been carrying something dark, something that's been following them across the country. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I do know that they're not entirely human. Emily pulled back, her head struggling to hear what West was telling her. So you are saying that this man was a ghost? West shook his head. Not exactly. There is more than that. What he was, I don't know. But I do know that he and others like him are not bound by the same rules that we are. They can come when they want, and when they go, they leave chaos behind. She was not able to sleep after the meeting. She felt that she was drowning in confusion, fear, and a feeling of being completely powerless. Could the man she had seen really be something otherworldly? Or had she just imagined it all? Could it be some kind of mass hallucination shared by the other passengers? But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Emily noticed that the people around her seemed distant, as though they were avoiding her gaze, or perhaps as though they were afraid of her. At night, she would hear whispers in the dark, voices she couldn't place. And every now and then she would catch herself gazing out her apartment window at the street below, convinced that she saw a figure, pale, gaunt, and empty-eyed, standing in the distance, staring up at her. The man was out there, somewhere, watching her. Emily was sure of it. One evening, overcome with the urge to snoop around, she felt she had to go to the airport, the same very one from which Flight 472 had taken off from. She roamed the hall without any direction, but the silence of the footsteps on the floor was ominous enough. The place had been drained of life. She saw him again. The man, standing by the gate, looking at her with those same hollow eyes. His face was gaunt, and his lips curled into something that almost looked like a smile. But there was no warmth to it, just cold, empty malice. Did you think you could escape? His voice echoed in her mind, sending a cold shiver down her spine. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She was unable to speak, move. She was locked, trapped in a gaze by something she knew could not be real. But it was an ice. Sigh. It was real, and as the lights above flickered once more, Emily came to the terrifying truth. The phantom passenger wasn't some figment of her mind. He was part of something far more sinister, something that haunted those late-night flights, creeping through holes in reality to infiltrate the unsuspecting passengers. And now, he is here. After that night, she never boarded another plane again. She tried to forget the memory, the phantom presence of the passenger haunting her. But wherever she went, he was there lurking in the shadows, his hollow eyes waiting. The flight crews, the airport staff, they would always insist there was nothing unusual about Flight 472, that nothing had happened. But Emily knew the truth. She was now a part of something much greater than herself, a traveler she could never get off the train from. And as for the man, well, he was just the start.